The movement was begun by a scientist who discovered, quite by accident, these signals being sent. Please understand, they are safe as long as they are not discovered.
A kill list was intercepted. It says everyone in this room will be dead. You're number 2 on the list. Well, who's number 1?
An unknown, a civilian.
Look out for Charlie.
I want him dead.
In the 1960s, the American public and the world began being blasted with auditory hallucination propaganda. This propaganda used actual stories and twisted them to fit their purpose. Psycho was based on Ed Gein, except they made the movie version's evil villain hear voices. Ed Gein did not hear voices. It was actually unheard of.
Strange young girls in for supper? By candlelight, I suppose, in the cheap erotic fashion of young men with cheap erotic minds.
Mother, please.
And then what? After supper, music? Whispers?
Mother, she's just a stranger. She's hungry and it's raining out.
Mother, she's just a stranger. As if men don't desire strangers. As if... Oh, I refuse to speak of disgusting things because they disgust me. You understand, boy? Go on, go tell her she'll not be appeasing her ugly appetite with my food.
She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you?
The DSM-1 was released in 1952. It was approved in 1951 and released in 1952. And the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Back then, people could hear a warbling or a sound in their ear or a whooshing of what would be considered a form of tinnitus today. Back then, it was referred to as auditory hallucination. There is no mention of voices in the DSM-1. None. In the DSM-2, released in 1968, the only time that is talked about is when they refer to alcoholics who are detoxing and going through a form of persecution complex, where they begin to experience types of hallucinations. Never does it talk about schizophrenics or other people just hearing conversations going on. Psycho is one of countless movies that shows one of the characters hearing voices throughout the movie. Countless movies have been made like this since Psycho. Psycho came out in 1960, and the mind control projects had been going on for 8 to 10 years before that movie even came out. And you were progressively hit with more and more movies about crazy people hearing voices.
The story begins here, just off the nation's front yard, the Mall. The shaper and molder of OSS was General Wild Bill Donovan. He said of his group's work, "We may have made mistakes, but we were not afraid to try things that were never done before." In this anything-goes atmosphere, Donovan appointed this man, Stanley Lovell, a Boston industrialist, to break new ground in many scientific and technical fields. Donovan called Lovell his Dr. Moriarty, after the fiendish professor in Sherlock Holmes. Lovell liked the name and posed for this Saturday Evening Post photo. He later wrote of his OSS job, "Throw all of your normal law-abiding concepts out of the window. Here's a chance to raise merry hell." It was in this atmosphere that the search for mind control began. As this 1952 CIA memo says, the aim is controlling an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against such fundamental laws of nature as self-preservation.
If the people are inundated with propaganda that average people can suddenly begin to hear voices and have conversations with people inside their head, then they will eventually begin to believe it if it begins to happen. And that is exactly what happened. In certain areas, pockets of the United States, people began to hear voices. And coincidentally, all of those voices were commanding them to kill. In 1970, John Linley Frazier was just a mechanic with a couple of kids who did average things. And suddenly, he began to hear voices. And these voices were from God, telling him to turn himself over and become a militant environmentalist. At that point, he began to stalk and kill people based on what they were doing to the earth. This did many things. It turned the hippies into killers. It flipped the whole flower power thing from a sort of passive Bolshevik revolution into a violent, crazy, lunatic thing. It would make people scared of hippies rather than the whole flower power thing. At the same time in Santa Cruz, right around the same time, there was a guy named Herbert Williams Mullen who heard voices in his head telling him to kill in order to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. They were trying different techniques on these people, and it had been so normalized in people's heads from Hollywood that they didn't question the reality of it. Could you actually hear voices telling you to go out and kill to prevent an earthquake? People did not kill because of voices in their heads telling them to do it. It did not happen before that. And suddenly you have 2, 3 cases in the same area at the same time. And then it just spread out. The sole purpose of MK Ultra was to create assassins, and that is exactly what they are doing. On top of that, they can warp and subvert psychiatric data according to bloodlines, medical data, and a myriad of other things.
To produce symptoms similar to those that you see in schizophrenia. On how much the patient knew about all this. We didn't delineate all the possibilities of what might happen because then you contaminate your experiment.
So you have success. This started in 1950. It was organized and put together and really going by 1952, the same year, coincidentally, that the DSM came out. And then by 1968, 1970, you have people actually hearing these voices, and because of the work of behaviorists, psychologists, and technology, less than 20 years later, you suddenly have wireless voice of God weapons that can command people to kill. But they couldn't stop with a few guys. They had to begin trying out different scripts, and at this time, it took a crew of people. It was an operation. So, suddenly you had these people on the East Coast that began to be hit with these weapons. Butch DeFeo of Amityville Horror infamy was hearing his family conspire against him in the other room. These were audio weapons, and it was meant to make him paranoid. And he's a perfect candidate because he was a partier, he used drugs, and it could be blamed on other things. After DeFeo killed his family, suddenly you still had the house set up for this. And the Lutz family moved in and began to experience this kind of stuff. So they shifted the operation to, let's not drive these people to kill, let's see if we can run them out of the house with these weapons. And they ran them out within a month. And that is what went down. It wasn't hocus pocus. It wasn't abracadabra. It wasn't demons and ghosts. These were operations. It started on the West Coast and it went to the East Coast. The next big one after the DeFeos was Son of Sam, David Berkowitz. If you look at all of David Berkowitz's letters, his letters are written in quotes. This is what he is being told. Before he was being attacked by quote-unquote demons, he believed that he was being followed by the FBI. He thought his phones were tapped. He thought all these things were going on. I have a new video on my Lookoutfa Charlie channel called Super Haunted Demon Possessed House, a brief look into the darkness with a flashlight. In that video, I prove to you exactly how these sounds ride off noise. And with that in mind, you can hear the voices riding off the footsteps of my boots through my house, which I could not hear at the time, but it is in the recording. This is what David Berkowitz was referring to when he heard voices within the dogs barking in his vicinity. He could hear voices riding on the dogs barking. It's the same technology that they were using in the 60s. The new technology is much more vast. It's everywhere. It's a surveillance system, and it is AI controlled. That is the only difference, is they are taking people out of it. What before took an operation of men takes absolutely nothing now, and it rides on existing infrastructure. The demon laugh was what I call surface audio. These were almost surface audio, but they were just underneath the boot steps. Let's listen to it. Right in sync with the boot steps. So they realized that the use of these scripts, God, demons, another person that they want assassinated, doing this to you, telling you that, oh, I'm the neighbor across the street doing this. Then the guy goes over and shoots the neighbor. Success. They realized that the ultimate goal of mind control could be achieved not through mind control, but through audio weapons and mind manipulation. You nudge them along with a script, a story. When you read the stories of people who hear these weapons every day, these scripts are all the same. There are only so many scripts. And there are different versions of this being created all the time, but they are essentially the same weapon. Different pieces of these weapons are integrated into the main weapon that is used everywhere, just like Woody Norris and his military weapon that can put any sound anywhere, which can really create fake hauntings, create schizophrenia, and nudge somebody along to ultimately kill, do something destructive, or get themselves put in prison based on what they are hearing and the fear and bewilderment of this happening to them.
So again, this idea of being able to put sound anywhere you want to is really starting to catch on. We've got the military had just deployed some of these into Iraq, where you can put fake troop movements a quarter of a mile away on a hillside. Or you can whisper in the ear of a supposed terrorist some biblical verse. I'm serious.
They're all laughing, and meanwhile, these weapons are being used on your children, your sons, your daughters, your brothers, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles, your entire family. Someone you know is affected by these weapons because they are AI controlled now. It does not take an operation. And that is what changed. The number of people who began to be affected by these weapons grew significantly in the 90s. But after all the infrastructure went up, the smart grid, the free Wi-Fi, wireless, everywhere, in the early 2000s, it exploded. After 9/11 and the Patriot Act, it exploded in the United States in record numbers. Numbers you couldn't even fathom. And that is when the entire game changed. There was a steady incline after Berkowitz, going postal, people hearing it. But as it became normalized, people didn't freak out about it as much. It actually became normalized, and people started to believe that these Norman Bates people that have conversations with people in their head actually exist in reality when they didn't before. This has literally all been an invention. It did not and does not happen in nature. And now they are all pretending it does. And once again, coincidentally, the DSM-1 came out the exact same year that MK Ultra kicked into full gear. I find that very, very strange. So the entire time that the agencies that were perfecting voice of God weapons as well as blue beam holographic technology, they were finding a perfect ally. Many perfect allies. And these allies were in the strangest places because they had to find a place to hide this. The people that they found as allies were none other than the UFO community, the paranormal community, the Bigfoot community, and other communities that deal with the unknown. They could actually test this stuff on people and get them to believe that it was aliens or a UFO or some other scenario that it really had nothing to do with. And they are still doing that today with ghost hunters, ghost adventures, and all these other UFO organizations, one after the other. And I'm not saying that these things don't exist. I'm telling you that they are so subverted and infiltrated by this stuff that you cannot trust it. And it is infiltrated. There is a legacy of infiltrating it. Just research Paul Benowitz. That's all I have to say about that. So their biggest allies are the UFO community, the paranormal community, the Bigfoot community, and most of all, the psychiatric and medical industries. These are huge allies in the ongoing of mind manipulation weapons. The Russian woodpecker was thought by many scientists to have an effect on brainwaves and our behavior and moods and all these different things. Well, after the Soviet Union fell, something was there to take the woodpecker's place. So in the early 1990s, HAARP went online and people began to hear the hum. And when people began to hear the hum regionally within the U.S. and then ultimately globally, this began to really pick up in numbers. And then this happened.
Holy shit!
The 9/11 operation happened, and after that, the Patriot Act was signed. And what this did was blow your constitutional rights out of the water. The people were looked at as terrorists. The people were looked at as the enemy. I will not mention any names, but I know a woman who has an Arab last name by marriage who was working in a large airport. And right after 9/11 in 2001, she was hit with voice of God weapons. True story. All the wireless infrastructure was going up. Cell towers were everywhere. People were noticing chemtrails crisscrossing the skies like mad. And it electrifies the skies. It makes them conductive. It wasn't just the people noticing this. What people forget is that there were actual weathermen that were commenting on it back then until they were told to shut up.
Here in Southern Oregon and Northern California, we've got a bit of an unusual situation. Now, this first portion of the radar cycle, fairly bland and typical, but then you see these bands of very distinct cloud cover moving into the region. That is not rain, that is not snow, believe it or not. Military aircraft flying through the region dropping chaff. Small bits of aluminum, sometimes it's made of plastic or even metallicized paper products, but it's used as an anti-radar issue, and obviously they're up there practicing. Now, they won't confirm that, but I was in the Marine Corps for many years, and I'll tell you right now, that's what it is.
So all at the same time, the 9/11 operation happens, the infrastructure goes up. All of these things happen at once. Chemtrailing becomes a huge thing, and suddenly people begin to get hit by this left and right, one after the other, average people in record numbers. And then the high incident projects start. What happens is you get shooting after shooting after shooting after incident after shooting after incident. And this continues and continues, and it happens so fast that you can't investigate it or get your head straight or even look at it and focus on it for 2 seconds before another one happens. And that is the intent. James Holmes, the Aurora shooter, was hearing the voice of Obama. In fact, many people have got on Reddit to talk about hearing the voice of Obama in their ear for a night, and then it will go away. So James Holmes was the Aurora, Colorado Batman shooter who heard the voice of Obama. 100% hit with weaponized RF. Aaron Alexis was the Naval Yard shooter that went in with a shotgun, and he complained for months that he was being hit with voice of God weapons and vibrational torture weapons before he did this. He even carved my ELF weapon into his shotgun before he went in there and did it. 100% of these people have been hit, and even people you don't know about. Myron May was a prosecutor, and ended up being hit with these weapons that disabled him and ruined his life. His life was destroyed by these weapons, and he ended up doing something really stupid, going to Florida State University. He was the university shooter there, and he was hit with these weapons. The Virginia Tech shooting, Cho, was targeted with these weapons and heard voices that drove him to do this. 100% of these people have been hit with weapons. Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the Boston bomber who was murdered before they caught the little brother. This guy was visited by the FBI and then suddenly had 3 voices talking to him at once and couldn't understand what was going on. And all the voices would do was belittle him and tell him to do things. It is just amazing when you research this. 100% of these people have been hit by these weapons. The Las Vegas Mandalay Bay shooter, Stephen Paddock, was telling people that he was a government mind control project and that they were messing with him just before this happened. And he ended up a patsy. He was 100% hit with these weapons. In fact, all you need to do is go to Google and type in shooter and then heard voices in quotes next to it, and go through every incident you see and research it, and it is one after the other after the other. Jason Dalton in Kalamazoo got a job driving Uber for his family to go on vacation. Completely normal guy. Out of the blue, he began to hear voices. I have videos about all of these cases, breaking them down and proving that these weapons were in the vicinity of the people when the events took place. Every single incident is related to voice of God weapons. Every single one. And here's how it all started. Back in World War II, the guys would go up by the radar to get warm because the radar put off heat. And they'd be sitting there rubbing their hands together, and they started reporting that they would hear clicks and pops behind their head. And when that began to happen and people caught on to what was actually happening, a scientist named it after himself, called the Fry effect. What that is the microwave auditory effect. Now, not all of these weapons are microwave anymore. They are different frequencies. What they realized is they could get people to hear sounds that only they could hear. And then they changed that to an easier radio frequency that they could get away with by sensitizing the person to the frequencies. Very simple, very easy. One system can do it. It doesn't take an operation. And these frequencies can ride on the infrastructure. It is AI controlled now. It is basically set it and forget it. Another one you can type into Google is killer and then heard voices. And you will get case after case after case in astonishing number that never happened in history before this time. This is not a theory. This is what is happening. And they are doing this to convince people that everywhere is dangerous. Everything is scary, and we have to get rid of guns. They're using this for a myriad of purposes, and one of those purposes is to get rid of guns. The other was the original intent, and the original intent was to turn people into killers, to turn them into assassins. That is what MK Ultra was all about, and that is what they've achieved, and they're getting there and perfecting it now. And this has been a brief history of Voice of God weapons brought to you by Lookout for Charlie. Thank you for watching. If you or somebody that you know is hit with these Voice of God weapons, do not respond to them, do not freak out, do not play the game, and do not follow the orders that are given to you. They are only Guantanamo Bay tactics. They use fear, stress, and intimidation to get the person off track in a state of bewilderment and then manipulate them to do things that they would never normally do. This is the product of MK Ultra. Thanks again. And that's it for now. Look out for Charlie. That's it for now. Look out for Charlie.
Oh, man. I like this kid. This fucking guy's crazy.
Look out for Charlie.
I want that son of a bitch dead. I want him dead.